29 years ago, a video game console was unleashed onto the world, and it's not just any old video game console, because it's a video game console that is arguably, and even objectively arguably, one of the most important video game consoles of all time. Now of course I'm talking about this little grey box here, the Sony PlayStation, and for your viewing pleasure today I'm going to show you my top 10 PlayStation games, and they're coming right up straight after these. Now, before we get on to my top 10 PlayStation 1 games, there are a few rules that I have set myself. Firstly, this is my top 10 list, not yours, not Metacritic's, and not old Bobby's next door. So if there's any games that are missing this top 10 list that you think should be in there, well, they probably weren't my top 10 games, and that's perfectly fine. Number 2, they have to be games that are in my collection, so this pile of stuff back here. And also, number 3, I'm not going to have any duplicates of franchises, so one game per franchise, and that seems fair. And one more thing before I move on to the top 10, I'm going to show a couple of honourable mentions that I should bring up because, well, I should bring these up because they didn't make it into the top 10, and I think a few people out there will be annoyed if these don't get shown at least. The first one being Soul Reaver, and that's obviously a classic game, but it's a game that I watched my father play more than I got to play myself. Now, my dear old dad was in his 40s by the time that the PlayStation got released, and certainly by the time Soul Reaver came out, so I'll be frankly honest with you, I was quite happy to sit and watch the old fella play some video games. Of course, Tom over at Sega Head will be most disappointed that Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver didn't make it onto my particular top 10, but I'm showing it here just in case I can avoid his wrath. So that's Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, not quite making it onto my top 10 list today. It may be some other day, you never know, because that's how these things work, but it's an honourable mention at the very least. Now, the second honourable mention is a game that I did play a lot of by myself and didn't watch my father, mother, brothers or anyone else play it, but the game that's only getting an honourable mention that some people might be surprised is Parasite Eve 2. Now, the reason that Parasite Eve 2 is only making an honourable mention in this list is because a good couple of friends over in Canada sent me this quite recently, which is Parasite Eve. Now, over here in Palland, we didn't get Parasite Eve, we did get Parasite Eve 2 however. So before I decide whether this fits onto a top 10 rather than this, I'm going to have to play this, not just once but twice and probably to death, just to see if Parasite Eve is better than Parasite Eve 2. So I can't really judge fairly on Parasite Eve 2 until I've done the first one, but that's the last of the honourable mentions. So let's move swiftly on to the first game in my top 10 must play god tier PlayStation games, and we'll start with Gran Turismo. Now, Gran Turismo might not be a popular choice when it comes to other people's top 10s when it comes to Sony PlayStation games. For me, however, when Polyphonic released this masterpiece, it brought me back into the car racing genre. Now, of course, I did play a lot of racing games back in the day, especially in the arcades and especially in the 80s. Games such as Outrun, Hang On, Chase HQ and Hard Driving all got their fair share of my pocket change back in the arcades. The problem being, by the time we got into the mid 80s, I wasn't really interested in arcade racing. So when Gran Turismo came along, the real driving simulator, I had to try it, and not only did I try it, but I absolutely played this to death. Now, I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, a lot of people stuck with the arcade racers, but for me, the RPG elements that they managed to squeeze into Gran Turismo just made the game all that more appealing to me. And of course, Gran Turismo 2, 3, 4 and so on went on to improve the series, but oftentimes for me, it's the original game that really sticks in the heart. And that's why Gran Turismo, the real driving simulator, comes in at number 10 on my top PlayStation games of all time. Coming in at number 9, we're moving away from driving simulations and onto ninja simulations, because at number 9 we have Tenu, Stealth Assassins. Now, of course, a lot of people will have Tenu on their top 10 list when it comes to PlayStation games, so it's probably not that much of a surprise to see it here today. At the time of its release, it was absolutely breathtaking. It's not that there hadn't been stealth games or ninja games before this, but everything about Tenu was just perfectly crafted well. It was at that time. Modern gamers and younger gamers maybe going back to play this for the first time now might find it just a little bit frustrating. Of course, it's got those good good old fashioned tank controls, and the draw distances, which were used to good effect in games like Tenu and some other games on the PlayStation, might just niggle a modern gamer. But if you truly want to see where the Souls-like games had their roots, and of course the stealth games, then you could do much worse than Tenshu, the Stealth Assassins. And that's why it's number 9 in my top 10 god tier PlayStation games that are currently in my collection. Coming in at number 8 in my top 10 PlayStation games in my collection, we have another game that's going to be in quite a few top 10 games. And that is Tomb Raider. Now, Tomb Raider, in my humble opinion, is worthy of any top 10 list, regardless of system, generation or even genre. Because with Tomb Raider, what we have is the birth of the 3D platform game, and not just that, the action puzzle 3D platform game. Now, many people will obviously gravitate towards Mario 64 when it comes to the beginnings of 3D platformers. But for me, the pinnacle is always going to be the early Tomb Raider games. Now, don't get me wrong, it does have its flaws, it does have those old school tank controls. And yes, it's also got those early not so great draw distances. But if you take the time and effort to learn how to control a game that uses tank controls, which is something that's not entirely impossible because we were all doing it back in the mid-90s, and just immerse yourself in the wonderful story that's told in Tomb Raider, then I think you'll come away loving it, and that's why it's in at number 8 on my top 10 PlayStation games currently in my collection. Coming in at number 7, we're going to have something a little bit different. It's a style and genre of game that wasn't really intended to be run on a console, certainly not on a controller anyway, and that game, coming in at number 7, is Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars. Now, for anyone out there who doesn't know what Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars is, it's quite simply the best point and click adventure game that you will ever play in your life. And I do know a lot of Monkey Island fans out there will be throwing stuff at their screens just now, but that's the beauty of video games, it's mostly all subjective. For me, the humour and the gameplay that was in Broken Sword was just head and shoulders above anything that LucasArts put out. But that's not saying that I didn't thoroughly enjoy the LucasArts games or play them to death when they come out. It's just on a personal level that Broken Sword pips them to the post when it comes to the best point and clicks out there. So Broken Sword Shadow of the Templars is a worthy number 7 in my top 10 PlayStation games from my collection. Now, coming in at number 6 is a game that many friends of the channel and long-term viewers will not be surprised to see, at least the genre won't be surprised to see, because coming in at number 6 we have Vandal Hearts. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Vandal Hearts, it's quite simply a strategy JRPG. And for anyone who doesn't know what a strategy JRPG is, well, try to picture battle chess, but not played on a chessboard, but played on an environment such as a town or inside a building, and coupled with an absolutely fantastic story to go with it. And with a lot of games that become my favourite games of all time, Vandal Hearts was the first example of a strategy JRPG that I had ever played. I had played other turn-based strategy games in the past, even way back in the 80s with Rebel Star, but the level of detail and story and just quirkiness that goes into the Japanese role-playing games sucked me in right from the get-go. So Vandal Hearts, a turn-based strategy JRPG, a worthy number 6 in my top 10 PlayStation games of all time in my collection. So now we're down to the last 5 games, so that's the top 5 of my top 10 of the PlayStation games in my collection. And coming in at number 5 is a game that I wouldn't be surprised to see in everyone else's top 10 list or even top 5 list, because that game is the amazing Resident Evil. Now, of course, I don't need to talk too much about Resident Evil because everybody knows about Resident Evil, but I will explain again why Resident Evil and not Resident Evil 2 makes it onto this particular list, and that's quite simply because the first game that I play in a series often is the one that grabs my heart the hardest. Now, I'm quite happy to state that Resident Evil 2 is technically a far better game than Resident Evil 1, but the first Resident Evil game was the first time I'd ever played a game in this genre of this style. And not only that, it was back in a time where you would not just play a game once and then move on to the next one, you would often play, replay and play again. And with Resident Evil, that's something that I did for a very long time. I could quite happily sit down with Resident Evil, play it from start to finish, which back when I was good at the game took me about an hour and a half, and then go and repeat that another 2 or 3 times. Now, of course, there have been games that have made me replay them time and time again, but nothing to the extent that I did when I played Resident Evil. I would go as far to say that I was trying to speedrun the game before speedrunning a game was really a thing. But it is a must-play game despite the tank controls. It's a worthy number 5 in my top 10 games of all time currently in my collection. Now coming in at number 4, we're staying with the Resident Evil themes because we're staying with the genre, we're staying with a similar style of gameplay, and most of you have probably guessed that game is Silent Hill. Now I would waffle on about how much I really loved Resident Evil when it came out and how often that I would play it, replay it and just keep playing it continually during a day. Silent Hill, however, was a completely different experience because what Silent Hill did was take the mechanics and similar sort of gameplays from Resident Evil but make the game a true horror game. Now if you haven't ever played Silent Hill, then I would encourage you to go and try and play this game because everything from the story, the graphics and even the way the camera moves within the game is meant to absolutely twist your noggin, and it's not even a slow starter when it comes to the twisted nature of the horror in this game because right from the get-go the protagonist Harry is plunged straight into this acid trip of a horror game. Now if I was going to do a top 10 of horror games of all time, then Silent Hill quite possibly could make it number 1, with its only competition for me being Silent Hill 2, but that would take us back to me playing Silent Hill first, and I truly do have a fondness for the first game that I play in a series, and especially if it's the first game in that series. But for a top 10 of PlayStation games in my current collection, then at number 4 Silent Hill sits proud and I'm happy to have it there. Now coming into number 3 is a game that's not going to surprise a lot of people out there. Well, not if you're a friend of me or a friend of the channel, because this is my home turf now. We're moving on to JRPGs. And at number 3, top number 3 game in my collection at the moment for the PlayStation, we have Breath of Fire 3. Now Breath of Fire 3 is such a fantastic JRPG. It has everything in it that you would want from a JRPG. You have the wonderful story of a young boy who's actually a young dragon who's trying to make his way in the world and go on to beat the big bad at the end. And yes, this is very classic JRPG fare. What Breath of Fire 3 done for me was bring in the gene mechanic. Now the gene mechanic in Breath of Fire 3 is quite simply this. Scattered all over the world are selections of dragon genes. And no, I'm not talking about denims, I'm talking about genetics. So one of the goals in the game is to go and find as many of these dragon genes as you can, so you can splice them with your own genes and other genes that you've found, allowing you then to morph into a range of fantastical different dragons with amazing different talents. And of course it has a wonderful overworld map, and it has lots of little villages and towns to explore, and a whole cast of memorable characters that you will love from the moment you meet them, and they will continue to be your friend for the rest of your life. Well, that's what happens to me anyway. So Breath of Fire 3, number 3 in my top 10 PlayStation games in my current collection. Now this is going to be a bit of an oddity because there is no number 2 game when it comes to my top 10 games on the PlayStation currently in my collection. I don't think there's a number 2 game in my top 10 or top 100 games for that matter, PlayStation games at all, because coming in at joint number 1, and people will not be surprised to see this because this is something I've talked about before, we have Final Fantasy VII and Suikoden 2. And yes, I have talked about both Final Fantasy VII and Suikoden 2 to death, and I could happily go on and talk about each of these games in detail again and again. Now you'll be glad to know I'm not going to bore you with that today. I'm just here to let you know that here in 2023, creeping up in nearly 30 years, I have 2 games at number 1 for the PlayStation, and not just in a top 10 of my personal collection, but the 2 greatest games of all time. And as much as I would like to be organised, neat and be able to pick one of these as number 1 and one is number 2, I think it's fair to say that at almost 30 years I don't think this battle will ever be won. So there you go my friends, that's my top 10 PlayStation games from my collection, and what did you think of those? Now if you don't want to talk about any of these games, because I would quite happily down in the comments talk to you about these games here, if you want to talk about games that I've omitted from this, maybe I don't have them in the collection yet, maybe I do and I just don't consider them a top 10 game, and that's perfectly fine. If you want to talk about them, drop that down into the comments, because the interaction between you and me and even crypto here is what makes YouTube special. It does for me anyway. Thank you again for watching as always, and until next time, cheerio.